post this online. Okay, so this week we're discussing the American Revolution. So first we have to start with the lead up to the American Revolution. And your book starts with the 7 Years' War, or the French and Indian War. Same thing. In England, they call it the 7 Years' War, but here in America, we call it the French and Indian War. So the French and Indian War is not a war between the French and the Indians. Who is it a war between? Who's fighting?
Britain and France.
Yes, exactly. So England is fighting against France, and the Native Americans, for the most part, have joined in with France to fight off the British, basically. The deal is, it starts in about 1754 and lasts for 7 years. That's why it's called that, right? Okay. So eventually, in the long run, England ends up winning this war, but it takes them a minute. And in the beginning, it looks like they are definitely not going to win this war. It starts essentially in, remember we talked about the different regions of the colonies, and the last region historians refer to it as the back country. So all that area in the west, to the west of the original colonies, the French and the Native Americans have a term for it. They call it the middle ground. And so the middle ground is essentially where the French and the Native Americans have set up trading posts. It's where they do most of their trading. And it is set up all in the middle ground. It really is basically the middle part of the country, that whole middle section there. But we start roughly in about the Ohio Valley area, Appalachian Mountain-ish, that part of the country. The French have set up a bunch of forts to protect their trade route in that area. England doesn't necessarily care for this. They would like to expand the colonies, right? So they send a very young George Washington. I think he's 20, when I say 23, he's young. He's young in his early, I'm sorry, somebody needs in. Okay, so he's young when he first comes over to the colonies. So they send a very young George Washington with about 160 Virginians and a group of Native Americans to go along that backcountry area and try to, at first the idea is to negotiate with the French, and then that becomes obvious that's not going to be a thing. And so at one point, the Native Americans who are in his command attack a group of French soldiers at Fort Duquesne, right? Fort Duquesne is the first one. It's not pretty. The Native Americans end up killing and scalping 13 of the French soldiers. So this upsets France greatly. They don't appreciate this attack. Washington and his men very quickly build a fort themselves, and they call it Fort Necessity is the name of it. So they very quickly set up Fort Necessity. West of the Appalachian Mountains, several hundred English soldiers then come to defend Fort Necessity. In the meantime, France is sending more soldiers as well. So we've got roughly 600 or so French soldiers and large groups of Delaware and Potawatomi Indians, all joining together. They attack Fort Necessity. Washington loses. Bad. In fact, Washington almost dies. He gets very nearly shot several times. I don't know if it's one of your readings or it's just something I've read. I don't know. I can't remember where I read it now. But when he takes off his uniform at the end of the fight, there are bullet holes in his jacket. So it's amazing he didn't get shot, but there are actually bullet holes in the sides of his jacket where he's so nearly shot several times. So we almost lost him there. However, this attack leads to a few of the leaders of the colonies to try to decide what to do moving forward. Ben Franklin, in particular. So Ben Franklin and a man by the name of Thomas Hutchinson. He's a representative from Massachusetts. They have this idea, and they draw up what we call, or what they called, the Albany Plan of Union. That's their original idea. So Ben Franklin has this thought that maybe it would be beneficial if all of the colonies got together and formed one sort of cohesive colonial government, and they all worked together. So all of the colonies should come together. They should have a council, a collective council, to exercise the power of war, peace, trade, taxes, all that sort of stuff. And they should elect a president to oversee this council. This is the original plan. The colonies, not a single colony agrees. All of the colonies say, no, we don't think that's a good idea. Mainly because they think that one colony would try to overrule all the other colonies, that one colony would try to get too much power, and to try to negotiate collectively when each region of the colonies was so different and made up of such different demographics and have different economics and are dealing with different Native American groups, that they didn't feel like one cohesive government would be, one, doable, but two, a good idea. Franklin's not thrilled about this. He actually publishes what most American historians think is our first ever political cartoon in response to this. And I know you've probably seen this, but it's the snake, and it's sectioned into the different, each section of the snake is a different colony, labeled a different colony. And it says, shoot, what does it say?
Is it Don't Tread on Me?
It's not that one. It's not that one yet, but it's right now I can't remember what it says. Oh, anyway, I'll look it up. I have the picture of it. But that's, he draws that. It's
Join and Die, or Join or Die.
Die. That's it. That's exactly it. Join or die. So that's basically what he thought about their idea about not joining the Albany Plan of Union. And after the American Revolution, when asked about the Plan of Union, Franklin basically says, if they had just listened to me in the beginning and we had set up this government, we probably could have negotiated our way out of this, and maybe we wouldn't even had to have fought a war. Who knows? But, you know, so Franklin said. So, okay. So no colony approves their plan. By 1755-ish, it looks like England is going to lose this war. They're outnumbered troop-wise. They are underprepared. They're undersupplied. It's not looking good for England. There is a new prime minister who is elected in England in 1757, and his name's William Pitt. And he basically decides to commit massive amounts of resources to this war. Spain has joined the war on the side of France, and so now the English are fighting both France and Spain. So William Pitt decides, you know what, we cannot let this stand. So he commits a lot of money and a lot of troops and a lot of resources to fighting France and Spain. By 1761, England has taken back a lot of those French forts, Fort Duquesne and Ticonderoga, and a couple other forts, very important trading posts. And then by the end of 1761, the English have also taken the city of Quebec and the city of Montreal. So we've taken two major French cities. The war kind of transitions away from the colonies. So the French and Indian War is basically our first ever world war. It involves a lot of different places. It moves off of the continent and occurs in lots of other places. Europe, Asia, specifically in India, Austria, specifically, the Caribbean islands. By the end of this thing, almost 1 million people are affected by the French and Indian War. So it's not a small little thing that happens. But by the end of 1761, all these battles have occurred in all these different places. England ends up taking not only most of the land the French have in the colonies, but also the Sugar Islands in the Caribbean. And they invaded Spanish Cuba on top of that. So lots of stuff that the French have taken back now. I'm sorry, that the English have taken back from the French now. By 1762, France and Spain sign the Treaty of Paris, which ends the French and Indian War. I'm going to give you a tip. If there's ever a question in a history class, and the question is, what treaty ended this war? More than likely, it's going to be the Treaty of Paris. There's about 4 or 5 of them. I don't know. There's a bunch of them throughout American history. There's a lot of Treaty of Parises. So it's just a good guess. If you don't know the answer, it's a safe guess. The Treaty of Paris. Don't put a date, but you should get some sort of credit for at least putting the Treaty of Paris. So there you go. Just a little history teacher tip there. Okay. So England wins the 7 Years' War, the French and Indian War. England finally wins that. It leads to a lot of conflict with the Native Americans because now England considers most of those Native American tribes who fought with France as quote unquote conquered people. So it gives the English a little more, not that they needed it, but it gives them a little more justification for taking their land, basically. I'm sorry, Brandy, you had something?
Wasn't it also that like because the Native Americans weren't involved in the Treaty of Paris or even brought or consulted with it, they were like, well, we have no treaty of peace.
That's exactly
There's
right.
nothing between us. So they also kept attacking?
Yes. The Native Americans are upset, to say the least. One, the ones who sided with the French are now considered a conquered people, so the English have no problem in taking their land. And the ones who sided with the British didn't get any kind of say so in how the land is divided, like what they got out of the Treaty of Paris. Yeah, they got absolutely no say so. So both sides of the Native Americans are not happy at the end of the war. And it leads to a lot of skirmishes between the Native Americans and the English. One in particular that your book talks about is Pontiac's War. You can read about that. And then, so all of this leads to the Royal Proclamation of 1763. The idea here is it's a proclamation to keep the colonists from expanding into Native American lands west of the Appalachian Mountains. That's basically the idea of it. But the proclamation is very careful not to say specifically that the land west of the Appalachian Mountains belongs to the Native Americans. It basically just says they recognize it as their hunting grounds, as their ancestral home. It doesn't specifically say anything like they own this land. It basically just says they have a right to be there, essentially. Which of course is going to lead to more problems very quickly. It's going to lead to more issues. The other thing is a lot of colonists who lived in the backcountry had already decided to stake claim to some of that land west of the Appalachian Mountains. And so now with the proclamation saying they can't do that, colonists are upset now too, because they feel like they're growing more and more upset with the English government as time is going on. They're building up a little bit of resentment over time. It's starting to happen. King George III becomes king in 1760. He's young, he's inexperienced. He's trying to figure it out when he first gets there. Have you ever seen Hamilton? They do a hilarious impression of George III in Hamilton. It's fantastic.
Yes.
That guy. Oh, I love that. Every time he comes on and sings, he's so great. It's funny though. Okay, so he's king in 1760. He also elects a new prime minister, where they get a new prime minister. George Grenville becomes prime minister in 1763. The thing is, a war is incredibly expensive, especially when you're talking about a war not on your own country, but when you're having to send troops elsewhere, and not just troops, but supplies and food and all the stuff that goes along, weapons, all the stuff that goes along with fighting a war somewhere else. That is incredibly expensive. So now they have to figure out how to make some money to pay themselves back after the end of the French and Indian War. The easiest thing to do is tax the colonists, raise taxes. That's just the easiest way to go about getting some money. So because of the whole idea of mercantilism, so basically the idea here is your colonies, a country's colonies, exist to make money for the mother country. It's basically what they're there to do. They're there to provide resources and goods and money to the country who owns them. And so the British subscribe to this policy, this economic policy. And so the idea is, okay, we have this land now. The colonists should start paying. Comparatively speaking, the colonists don't pay nearly as much taxes as British citizens in England, comparatively speaking. However, what we quickly see is that the colonists don't appreciate being taxed because they have no say-so in how they are taxed and what they're taxed on and what that tax is. So even though they're not paying the same as British citizens in England, they still don't appreciate being taxed without some sort of representation in Parliament, right? That leads to the whole, no taxation without representation. That becomes sort of the slogan for the American Revolution. So, okay, so taxes. Start passing taxes. The first one they pass is the Sugar Act. The Sugar Act gets passed in 1764. It's also called the American Revenue Act, or the Currency Act, whatever you want to call it. It's the Sugar Act. It's just the easiest way to refer to it, because then you know what's being taxed. They're taxing sugar. That's the easiest way to do it. Specifically, they are taxing sugar and molasses that is being imported from the sugar colonies. Molasses mostly gets used to make rum, but also sugar. And so they tax sugar, other goods imported into the colonies. Part of the Sugar Act also is to raise the penalty for smuggling. If you get caught smuggling stuff into the colonies, then you are more severely punished. And the last part of that is if you are caught smuggling, or if you're suspected of smuggling, then you are tried in a naval court, essentially. You're basically tried by the British Navy in a naval court. You're not tried by you don't get a trial by your peers. You don't get a trial by jury. You get tried in a naval court, which is different than British citizens and different than what the colonists have been accustomed to and are used to as British citizens. So, two things are happening now. One, taxation without representation, and they have lost the ability to be tried by a group of their peers. So these are two things that they, as British citizens, feel are their inalienable rights. They should have those rights guaranteed to them as British citizens. And they feel like they've lost both of those. So they're growing more and more upset with the English government as these things happen on and on and on. Okay, so the second thing that gets passed, it's not a tax, but the second law that gets passed by Grenville is the Quartering Act. It's not what a quarter is. It's not just a Led Zeppelin album, no quarter. It's a, yes.
Isn't it where like they get to go into people's houses
Yes.
and private residences for, I forget if it says for no specific time, just for as long as they need it.
Yes, exactly. So they pass a law that says colonists have to provide food and lodging and housing for British soldiers who are in the colonies. So without your say so, they can come into your home and stay there. You have to provide them quarter, is what that is. And so the colonists are like, wait, what? No, that's not fair. That's why, right? So, okay, so not thrilled about that either. It's another little thing just adding on. So, not thrilled about having to quarter British soldiers. And then another tax gets passed. This time it's the Stamp Act. Basically, what that is the British government requires you to buy a stamp or pay a tax specifically on any kind of paper product. So newspapers, just regular writing paper. They even go so far as to tax playing cards because they consider those paper products. So any kind of paper goods, they pass a specific tax on, the stamp tax. And so this upsets two specific groups of people in the colonies. And really two groups of people that you don't want to necessarily upset. Can you think of two professions that use paper every day? Just in general?
Wasn't like one of the big ones like all of the merchants and stuff, because they had so much paper that they had to sign.
Yes.
And then eventually I think the act gets revised or something. I remember reading where like without the stamp they couldn't even leave the harbor.
Yeah, it becomes a whole thing. So the very large business class, the wealthy merchants, and that includes not just merchants, but also lawyers. Because if you drew up any kind of deed or any kind of contract or any kind of whatever, you had to get some lawyer to do it. So lawyers and merchants. And then the last group of people are the newspapers. So the press and the rich people in town are the two groups of people who they feel unnecessarily taxed, highly taxed. And so they start printing protest announcements in the newspapers to try to combat this. And the upper class merchants and lawyers and all these sorts of guys come together and they're like, hey, wait a minute. Why are we paying all this money? So yeah, two groups of people who you probably don't want to upset in a society. I don't know, just in general. However, okay, so they start forming ideas about starting to protest. This becomes sort of a seed planted here. And we get the first real idea about the beginnings of the Sons of Liberty and the Daughters of Liberty. So the Sons of Liberty are first. They start first. They don't call themselves that yet. They're just a group of men who meet to discuss how to directly, I guess, combat the things that are happening in the colonies that they don't agree with. And they start doing things like, they start hanging tax collectors in effigy. So they make like a mock-up kind of a doll-ish type of thing, and they hang it in the town square, and it's supposed to be represent the tax collector. Of course, if you're the tax collector in that town, you're thinking, oh crap, that's supposed to be me. They want to hang me. You know, that's a little scary. They start vandalizing tax collectors' homes. I think they burn a few down. It gets ugly. At one point later on, they start, they would find tax collectors and basically pour tea down their throats until they threw up. So, like, waterboarding them with tea, basically. And at the very end, right, like during the beginnings of the American Revolution, they go so far as to actually tar and feather tax collectors. That is an insanely painful, painful thing to do to somebody.
Yeah, that's a horrible way to go out.
Not awful. You basically like pour hot tar on somebody and then cover them in feathers.
And what happens when it hardens? Like it basically like then peels the skin.
Yes, exactly.
Like I said, horrible way to go out. I'd rather just be hanged at this point.
Yes. You have to like peel it off, and it doesn't just come off. Like you have to scrape it off, and it's not just the tar that comes off, it's also skin. It's really, and your skin has been burned because the tar was hot. And so it's just, it's incredibly painful thing to do to somebody. But yeah, they go so far as to do a little bit of that during the American Revolution. It gets scary. They almost bury some guy alive. It's a lot. It's a lot. The Daughters of Liberty, on the other hand, are slightly different. They do things like they control the boycotts. So any kind of British goods that are being imported into the colonies, they set up a way to boycott those goods. So material, cloth, wool, all that kind of stuff, they start spinning their own. They start making their own. So they don't have to buy the British version of it. They make their own soap. They don't buy tea. They don't buy sugar. All kinds of anything British imported. They try to find a way to get around it so they can boycott that. They don't have to buy any of those British goods. And it really allows women to become part of the protest movement. For the first time, they kind of get they have a role. And not just a small role. That's hitting England in the pocketbook is exactly what the English are trying to avoid here. They're trying to make money, and they're protesting by not giving them any money. And so it's a really good way to protest against the English in the beginning. So you have Sons of Liberty, Daughters of Liberty. They do a couple different things. Okay, so protests are starting to happen. The colonists are getting more and more upset with the English government as time passes. Eventually, it goes so far to where we have we get to, wait, is this before or after? No, before. Okay, so eventually we get to 1768-ish. The British seize John Hancock's ship in the port of Boston. John Hancock's a famous merchant. You know John Hancock? Yes. You've heard that name, right? You know who that is. Yeah. You sign your John Hancock. Yes. Okay. The first guy to sign the Declaration of Independence. So he is a wealthy merchant in Boston. And one of his ships, ironically called the Liberty, is seized in Boston Harbor by the British. They accuse him of smuggling. And so they seize his ship and look, and they don't find any evidence of smuggling. And so the colonists are upset that the British soldiers in Boston have taken this step, have taken it this far. And so it causes the citizens to basically riot in Boston. Because of this, because of the riot, British then send an additional 4,000 troops to Boston to try to put down these riots and these protests. Just to give you an idea about how many soldiers that is in a city the size of Boston at the time, the population of Boston in 1768 is roughly about 15,000 people. And the British just sent an additional 4,000 soldiers. A lot of soldiers for a town that size, population that size. So tensions are already high, and now you're adding more soldiers to the situation, which doesn't make anybody feel any better. That's for sure. Tensions are still really high, and when the soldiers come, it just amps it up a little more. All the way until we get to the Boston Massacre. March 5th, 1770. Boston citizens are throwing snowballs and rocks at the British soldiers. They're taunting the British soldiers with snowballs and rocks. And I'm sure quite a few choice words. So the British soldiers are upset by this. One of the somebody in the crowd, one of the citizens, the Boston citizens, dares them to fire a gun. One of the British soldiers does, and as soon as one of them does, the others start firing, and they end up shooting how many people? I think they shot 11 people. They killed 5 citizens. They opened fire on the citizens. They end up killing 5 civilians. Paul Revere, who is a silversmith in Boston at the time, makes an engraving, and he calls it the Boston Massacre. I mean, it's 5 guys, but still, the Boston Massacre sounds way worse than, the Boston shooting or something. I don't know what else you'd call it, but anywho, so they call it the Boston Massacre, and it gets people really riled up. They arrest the soldiers, and they're moved to an island off of the Boston coast for their own protection, so nobody tries to kill these dudes. So they're moved off out of the city, and they're put on trial. They are actually put on trial, and John Adams, one of our founding fathers, John Adams, agrees to represent them. He is their lawyer. John Adams has already been very vocally opposed to the policies that England has been putting in place. He has been a vocal critic of the British so far. So why in the world would he agree to defend these British soldiers?
Didn't he say something along the lines of like he believed in everybody getting the same fair trial and chance?
Yes, exactly.
Regardless who they were?
That's exactly right. So he's a very smart man. And there's an HBO series, John Adams, that's got Paul Giamatti playing John Adams. It's fantastic. It's really well done. It's long though, but it's very well done. But this is included in that. But he basically says he wants to prove that the colonists are not just a bunch of rebellious rabble rousers, that there are people in the colonies who fully believe in the rule of law and civility and, you know, being lawful citizens, basically. So he takes their case and he wins. He wins the case. It's acquittals for all of them except for 2 of the soldiers. 2 of them are convicted of manslaughter, but that's a way lesser charge than murder. And so anyway, but yeah, he wins. He wins their case for them. The British end up repealing some of their taxes and acts that they have passed so far, to try to appease the colonists a little bit. The problem is that it has been going on for years now, and the colonists at this point have almost been pushed too far. It's started something that cannot just be stopped. They have been pushed a little too far for them to fully come back to just being British citizens living in British colonies at this point. So their 2 main rallying cries at this point, the 2 big things that the colonists are pushing for is 1, representation in Parliament. They're being taxed and they feel like they have no say-so in Parliament, so they want some representation. The other thing is they feel like they are owed trial by jury, basic fundamental right, and they still don't have those things. And so to them, it's still worth fighting for. Yeah, okay. So in 1773, the British passed the Tea Act in 1773. The colonists meet to decide how to deal with this new tax on tea. It's a tax on imported British tea. And it may not sound like a big deal to us now to tax tea, but you have to remember that these guys are British citizens. They're raised on tea. They have tea every day. It's their normal drink. And so
Wasn't one of the problems is because the tea, how it was sold to them, they were in massive blocks. And
yes.
you had to scrape it off, so they were super expensive and stuff like that,
Yes.
and they're just mad about it.
Yes. You couldn't just buy tea bags. You had to buy like a chest of tea, which is like hundreds of pounds of tea. That's another part to it. In December of 1773, they all get together. They have a meeting to discuss the Tea Act and what to do about it. They have a meeting. They don't really come to any sort of final conclusion about what to do with the Tea Act. And the British have decided not to take off the tax of British tea. And so on the 16th of December, 1773, at the end of that meeting, 150 colonists, dudes dressed as Native Americans, whatever, they dress as Native Americans, and they board British ships who are in the port, in the port of Boston, and they throw all the tea into the Boston harbor. It's not just a little bit, it's 340 chests of tea, which equals about 90,000 pounds of tea into the Boston harbor and destroy it all. That is a considerable amount of money back then. We're talking a lot of money that they just dump into the ocean. 3 ships in total. They ruin all the tea. It's a whole thing. The Sons of Liberty are the ones who instigated this protest, basically. Okay, so to punish this act of vandalism, the English pass something called the coercive acts. They call them the coercive acts. In the colonies, they call them the intolerable acts. A little different. They both refer to the same thing. Basically, what the English do is they close the port of Boston, shut it down. 2, they annul the Massachusetts Bay Colony Charter. So they basically say Massachusetts Bay is no longer a British colony. 3, they dissolve or restrict the colony's political organizations. So the governor, the council, all that, they essentially dissolve all of that. So none of those people have any say-so anymore in Boston.
And then, sorry, and then
No.
wasn't it that like none of the colonies could have any type of like meeting or get together regardless, unless it was approved by English?
Yes, by the British, exactly. Yeah. So they're not recognizing colonial governing bodies anymore, which those have existed now for several years because you remember we talked about last time, the colonies needed some sort of governmental system in each colony because asking England for every single little thing took forever because you have to send something to England and wait for it to come back. It just took too long. So colonial governors really did have a lot of power. And so to say that they can't hold any meetings, they can't discuss anything moving forward, yeah, that's a huge deal. They're basically dissolving colonial governments at that point. It's a big deal. And then the last thing that they did was they allowed the British to quarter all of their troops in British homes. I mean, they had to do that anyway, but that was something they didn't take away. The British troops stayed there, and they were allowed to quarter them to be quartered in colonial homes. So Boston's less than happy, to put it mildly. They're upset about this tremendously. The rest of the colonies are upset too because they feel like it's only a matter of time before that spreads and before England decides to do that to everybody if they want to. If they can do it to Massachusetts, why can't they do it to us? It's going to be the same. Some of the colonists, I don't want to say all of them, but some of the colonists are mad that the British had forced them to resort to such actions. Basically, like, you made us do these protests. You imposed so many ridiculous rules and taxes that you left us with no choice. There's another group of colonists who feel like the protest, and specifically the Boston Tea Party, was too radical, and it gives the colonists a bad name. It shows that they are uncivil and rabble rousers, and maybe the British need to take us in hand. Basically, they need to get something done, and this is what had to be done.
There's always two sides.
Yes, exactly. So there's this group of people who are like, no, we've got to protest. This is ridiculous. And then there's another group of people who are saying, we are British citizens still. We're British citizens. They are the government. He's still our king. They're still our government. We should obey to the best of our ability what they say we should do. We don't want to come off as, uncivil. So, so two groups of people trying to decide what the next step should be, basically. Okay. I think I'm going to stop there because what comes next are the meetings. All the meetings with the important people from all the colonies. And we'll talk a little more about that on Wednesday, and the Declaration of Independence. We'll cover that on Wednesday too, the big one. So Does anybody have any questions about any of this or what you need to be doing for this week? Is everybody good? Okay, good deal. If you think of anything, let me know. Oh, wait, I'm sorry. One more thing before. There is SI meetings this week. Natasha posted a link for the schedule for the SI meetings this week to help you specifically get ready for your midterm. So if you would like any kind of help or have any questions for her, she posted the schedule on the class webpage. Okay. And you can email me anytime if you have questions as well. Okay. If everybody's good, then I think that's it for me today, and I will see you Wednesday. Okay.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye, guys. Have a good day.
You too.
Bye. You as well.
Thank you.